Right, like Tom mentioned, my name is Taryn Stone. I'm a partner at the healthcare group at Ice Miller. I do mainly healthcare M&A, but for the past couple of years, I've been doing a lot of private equity work with them. So I am moderating the private equity panel, and I'm going to let each of the panelists spend a few minutes introducing themselves and talking a little bit about what they do every day.
I'm Scott Kaufman. I'm a partner with North Lane Capital Partners. North Lane is a control-oriented buyout shop headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland. We're currently investing out of a $1 billion fund that we raised in 2014, focused on two sectors, business services and healthcare. And we've had a number of healthcare investments, primarily service-oriented businesses, but have also done some things in and around the medical device supply chain, contract manufacturers, things like that. We probably spend 60 to 70% of our time within healthcare, and I'm happy to be here today.
Nick Agnes with Brookside Mezzanine Partners. I think I'm the only lender on the panel today, but we were founded in 2001. We're headquartered in Stamford, Connecticut. We've raised $900 million in committed capital across 4 funds, and we're investing out of our new fund raised in 2019, and it's $375 million. We're a junior capital provider, mainly providing subordinated debt, also some unitranche debt, and minority equity capital, predominantly in sponsor-backed companies, but we're also partnering with independent sponsors as well. While we're generalists, we do a lot of manufacturing, business services, distribution, some consumer retail. I'd say about 20% of what we do is healthcare, and out of that bucket, I'd say 80% of our healthcare is healthcare service. So a lot of practice management. We've invested in a lot of dental service organizations, behavioral health, dermatology, pediatric care, some durable medical equipment on the other side, nurse staffing businesses, and so we're comfortable with reimbursement. And I'd say the only other thing I'd add, our companies are typically 3 to 20 million in EBITDA, and we're writing check sizes usually 5 to 25 million.
My name is Reed Peterson. I'm a vice president of Vago Healthcare Capital. Vago is a $350 million committed capital private equity fund. We're based out of Alpharetta, Georgia, which is about an hour north of downtown Atlanta. We also have an office here in Manhattan. We are exclusively focused on healthcare. What we do primarily falls into 3 buckets: building teams around commercial pharma products that we acquire from large pharma, healthcare services, buy and build type of stuff, and investing in niche service providers to large pharma companies. And we typically invest in companies with between 2 and 15 million of EBITDA and control-oriented investments only.
Hi everybody, my name is Vladimir Andonov. I want to thank Lou and the host for having us today. I'm the Director of Business Development at Martis Capital. It's a lower middle market healthcare only private equity fund. We used to be called Capricorn Healthcare, and we branded about a year ago when we were raising our latest fund, which was a $545 million committed capital. Some similar themes, but our focus is only on healthcare, and within that we specialize, spend most of our time on the services side and the technology side, as well as a little bit on the consumer side, diagnostics. We have 2 offices, Palo Alto, which is where I'm based, and then DC, and invest in companies north of 5 million EBITDA and write checks about 30 to 50 million.
Great. So I'm going to start off with a relatively simple question, but would like to, obviously healthcare is really broad, as shown by all the different things that you guys mentioned you've worked on. But if you could each share what segment of the healthcare industry is the most appealing to you right now and why?
For us, I think on the demand side, I mentioned dental and germ, and when you think of there's 50 million boomers today, or people over the age of 65, that number is going to maybe 70, 80 million in the next 10 years. The derm business we invested in was in Texas. You have a growing population, exposure to sun, increasing skin cancer. So I think that's an example of the demand side, and we get comfortable with it. Behavioral health, you have 30 million opiate-dependent individuals, and some studies read 1 in 5 individuals have a mental health issue. Ophthalmology, you have people over age 65, increasing prevalence of cataracts, and like 25, 30 million people with cataracts. So I think on the demand side, we usually get comfortable, even though those spaces have a lot of demand, very high purchase multiples. If they're a quality provider with strong compliance and track record, strong referral sources, and they're able to recruit doctors and providers, or they're lower end staff, then I think we usually get comfortable with the demand side. So then it comes down to can the practice execute on that strategy? And so I think we're seeing a lot of opportunities in those types of spaces.
One area where we're spending a lot of time right now is in and around the clinical trial sector. Anything that attempts to drive efficiencies in that process, just given the amount of money that biopharma spends to get a drug to market, the rise of technology. There's lots of firms that are doing lots of different things, both on the technology and the outsourced services side, serving the biopharma industry and CROs for that matter, to help drive efficiencies. And thematically within our healthcare practice, broadly defined, we are most focused on companies that drive efficiencies and costs down within healthcare, but specifically within the clinical trial sector. That's one area where we've made actually 2 investments. One business was an IRB, so an institutional review board, so providing regulatory compliance services to the clinical trial market, and currently are invested in a niche clinical CRO that helps provide remote visit services, so trying to de-emphasize the importance of clinical trial sites to help boost participant retention during the process, because that's one of the big inefficiencies is you have these people who sign up to participate in a trial, and it becomes too burdensome for them to go in and have their blood drawn or whatever it is on a regular basis. So they send home health professionals to the house or to the assisted living facility, wherever these subjects are, to try to enable the retention rates, or to try to drive retention rates. So that's just one area of healthcare we're focused on right now.
Glad you would go.
Yeah, sure. I think one area that one way we invest in general is around themes, investment themes that we identify. So I can talk about a couple. One is a very big one, which most people here will know, value-based care, which we've heard for many, many years, and it's been slow to finally come. I think we're finally seeing some signs where providers are starting to get paid specifically based on outcomes and punished if they don't deliver that. So the question is then, how do you tackle that opportunity? Is it through technology? Is it through providers? So we've looked at both, and I think there's some interesting opportunities on the technology side that enable value-based care. Related theme for us is telemedicine broadly. I think years ago you'd see companies come up that are small and didn't have much reimbursement, so the business models were questionable if they'll survive. But there's clear demand for it, especially not just in rural areas where there's no hospital within reasonable range, but even in populated markets where there's just much more efficient to do a remote visit through the video. So we looked at some of those businesses. And the last one I'll say, which we'll probably talk a fair bit today, and everybody in this room probably has heard a lot about, just the physician practice side. I think the reason why we still like it is it continues to be highly fragmented, especially in some areas. I think you mentioned dental. We've looked at a fair bit in orthopedics, as well as fertility. And so the area which we focus a lot is alignment with the physicians, which I'm sure we'll talk about down the road. But those are some of the 3 areas.
Great. Marie?
So we've been spending a lot of time in kind of niche consulting firms to pharma, and also in looking at some opportunities in the physician practice roll-up space that are a little bit earlier in the consolidation curve. Derm, ophthalmology, and dental have been around a long time, but we've looked at some opportunities in ENT and allergy and podiatry, and also in kind of autism therapy, which have been really interesting. They're kind of an emerging trend.
And I should mention, if you guys have any questions, obviously feel free to ask. I have a list of questions, but clearly it should be more of a conversation, and would rather you ask the questions than the ones that I've come up with. So feel free. That leads me into the next one. Do you think there are any segments that have sufficient market penetration? We talked a little bit about dental. Reed, you mentioned a few other ones. Are there any other areas that you think may have penetration, or do you still think that there are a lot of deals out there to be done even in those kind of more popular segments?
Oh, is that open-ended question?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, the spaces that I mentioned are definitely more crowded. I think you're right, like dental and derm is probably more in the 6th, 7th, 8th inning of these consolidation plays. However, there's still, I think with dental, it's like less than 10% of dentists are part of the DSO. So there's still that trend of consolidation. There's still, if we talk about value-based care, and it's tough for an individual provider to contract with a large managed care payer. So being able to be part of a larger group, you have the back office, you have the infrastructure, you probably have better data where you could show outcomes to those payers. I think there's still opportunity in those sectors, but we've heard crazy things like autism deals going for 18 times EBITDA and looking for 7 times leverage, and those probably aren't the deals that we're going to invest in. But we have started seeing some like in the fertility space and like other types of group practices as well.
I think a nuance to your question is a little bit how you play some of these areas, even though they might be crowded at the platform level. I think some of the colleagues here approach it through the buy and build, or just backing an executive and starting from the ground up. The fertility example I gave is a little bit like that. There's a little kernel in the center around which we'll build the business. It has, call it 10, 15 of revenue. And I think historically that's something we shied away from given the risk profile, but just to be competitive in the marketplace and avoid paying double-digit multiples if we can. That's one approach where it really comes down to the team, because the opportunity is still there, the consolidation.
I do think there are sectors where it's a lot harder to make money because of the existence of sizable platforms, dental, derm, some of these areas where there are large consolidators. All of a sudden every little, $2 or $3 million EBITDA or $1 million EBITDA company thinks they're a platform and wants a platform type multiple. Makes it tough, especially for lower middle market funds, who don't have a platform, to go out and try to build that. So to Vlad's point, in some ways it's almost easier to kind of build it on your own versus convince one of these business owners that, look, with our help, maybe you can get to be a platform, or maybe we found that diamond in the rough, that $5 million company that nobody's come across yet that can be a platform. But I think in some of those areas it is pretty picked over, which is why other groups are going to some of these other areas. And even vet or pain management, even some of those are starting to get a little overbought. Again, not saying you can never make money there. Even in the lower middle market, it's just a lot more difficult, which is, we in the past had an investment in a denture-focused DSO, but we'll still look at a lot within the practice management sector, but it's not necessarily top of our list right now, just due to where we are in the cycle and so many of the therapeutic areas.
I think dental is there's still some pretty compelling opportunities there, particularly if you're willing to go smaller to $1 million, $1.5 million EBITDA deals. There's still some reasonable multiples there, or look at deals that have some hair, some hair on them. So there's some dental groups that have may have great operations, may have high quality and good compliance, but 3 years ago somebody may have died in the chair or something like that, and there's ways to mitigate some of that risk through legal documents and escrows and stuff like that. But there are definitely some hair on those deals.
With the current economic outlook, do you have any concerns, or do you believe? I think we hear a lot about healthcare being recession resistant or recession proof. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
I think the easy answer here is anything that's more discretionary, some of the cosmetic dental work. On the opposite side, the vet, we haven't talked about vet a lot, but it's still healthcare just for animals, and it's a good area to make money, and most of us, I think, know. That's very counter-cyclical, except if you go to the sort of ER side or elective procedures where people just postpone. So we know healthcare is resistant, employment within healthcare is pretty resistant, but there's pockets where if it's more discretionary, then I think in the next few years it might be affected negatively.
I think, Nick, you talked about the aging population. I mean, there's some factors like the
Yeah, the
aging
demand
population.
side, and then I think you have to get comfortable that if there's a recession that, we've invested in some Medicaid-dependent businesses, maybe they're in 2 states, and you have to really dig into that particular state's budget, and we'll do a reimbursement study alongside the sponsors, and you have to be comfortable that it's kind of like an essential service. So like something, we invested in a pediatric dental business, pre-ACA expansion, children were already covered. So we were like, if ACA gets repealed, children should still get covered. If we're wrong, I may have also a different perspective than them. Again, we're predominantly debt focused, so we're focused on the downside, but we're hopefully investing in a capital structure that will model 4 or 5%, even greater reimbursement rate cuts. And oftentimes in a lot of our structures, like EBITDA can go down, we think 30-35%, and we could still kind of maintain we focus on the fixed charge coverage ratio above 1 time. So I think the control equity folks on the panel may have a different perspective on that, but that's how we look at it.
Yeah, as Vlad said, we're obviously more focused on non-discretionary businesses within healthcare, given the likelihood of a recession at some point in the next several years. As a fund that invests in non-healthcare sectors, I'd say we're definitely focused more on healthcare than maybe some of our non-healthcare sectors right now, just due to the dynamics of the healthcare market and the fact that it has historically performed better in recessions than some of the other sectors. One thing that we're focused on kind of within the pharma services practice that we have is making sure we're in areas of pharma services where expenditures can't be deferred or delayed, or are less likely to be deferred or delayed. During the last recession, we had an investment in a preclinical CRO, so very early on in the drug development pipeline, and got caught, frankly, in that the drug companies still spent some money, but they spent a little bit less and took all the money they had been putting in the preclinical and deferred that, or moved that all into their clinical, such that their clinical expenditures didn't fall, but the preclinical got hammered. Luckily, we weathered the storm and kind of saw the pendulum shift back, if you will, but that has made us very mindful going forward to think more about how and when pharma can change their spending habits based upon the broader economic environment.
Yeah, I would agree with what Vlad said as well. I think the majority of on the healthcare services side of the non-elective type of industries are pretty recession resistant. On the pharma side, I think it's a little bit of a different dynamic where if you look at the phase 2 and 3 big drug development programs, those are actually, funding for those is actually secured between 2 and 4 years in advance of actually running the trial. So if there is a recession and funding dries up, right now you're not going to see the impact of that until 2-3 years down the line. And that's what you saw in the 08-09 period as well. So you saw clinical trial get spending, R&D spending get really hit in 2-3 years after the recession.
So some of you only take majority equity positions, while others have done deals as junior lenders. So Nick, can you talk about a deal or two where you've taken less than majority equity position, and then I'm gonna kind of talk on the ones that only take the majority equity position?
Yeah, well, we've never.
Oh, sorry. I just was asking, so we have 2 panelists that pretty much only take a majority equity interest, and we have 2 others that don't always, and so I want them to kind of talk about some deals that they've done have Nick go first, and then
Yeah.
Vlad, I think, and then have Scott and Reed kind of talk about the other side.
Sure. Well, we're never taking majority
Right,
position
right.
there, but
Vlad was
and like, especially in healthcare, I'd say this is probably similar to retail consumer restaurants. Like, we'll only invest with sponsors that have healthcare experience. So we're always minority equity investor. I think in all our healthcare service deals, we do have some equity exposure. I would say there's some businesses we've invested in that are smaller, 3 to 5 million of EBITDA. Some lenders would shy away from. They might be single state Medicaid exposure, but again, we're in it with a sponsor that we know that has a strategy to diverse to a new state. So they're trying to get into new geography. They're trying to diversify the payer base. So in that scenario, we may start in unitranche structure. We might buy a slug of equity, and then once it grows and diversifies, we'll tell the sponsor, let's get a traditional senior lender in here. We'll convert to a sub debt, and then. But we've been part of a lot of these buy and builds where they do diversify into other states, and we'll always invest our pro rata share of the equities, but it's always in a minority manner.
Vlad, I think you do both, but can you talk
Yeah,
about?
sure, minority. And to clarify, for us that means probably significant,
Yeah.
as in 30 to 40. We view it as another tool in the bag, in addition to the majority and the buy and build. And it can serve as a differentiator. For one, if you are approaching a founder who's not interested in selling a majority of their business, that's one thing I always point out. It's not we go in there and it's going to be this deal. We want to hear what the circumstances are, what makes most sense. A couple other points maybe to highlight. Usually a minority deal would get you a slightly lower valuation than a control deal, especially in businesses with physicians where alignment is paramount, especially if there's 4 physicians that bring in the lion's share of the sort of production. You want to make sure post-transaction they're fully aligned. And so that in those situations is where we've done a couple deals where it makes sense to take a minority. And the last thing I'll highlight, which is very important, is using legal counsel. We structure these really to look a lot like control deals, where there's a lot of negative controls on hiring, firing, M&A, forced sale down the road, or a put right back to the company. So we really view them as very similar on the outside to control deals, even though they're structurally and from a pure number standpoint less than 50%.
There's definitely deals, we are by our investment mandate control-oriented investors. There's definitely deals we see where we frankly choose not to pursue because of the risk profile of the deal and say, hey, if we could do a minority deal or if we could invest in the Medicare, that's where we want to be. But just given the makeup of our fund, we are focused only on control deals. Some of that's just the preference that we've had over time. We've had a minority deal in the past that didn't go well, and so we've kind of learned from some of our, granted limited sample size, but some of our mistakes, which has driven us to be a control-oriented fund. And in most cases, that's how we approach the deal with that mindset, and impacts our go or no-go decision as we evaluate the opportunity.
And we've actually looked at a number of minority deals and have found that in order to get comfortable with the amount of negative and control provisions we would need in the legal documents are so restricted it almost defeats the purpose of having a minority deal, and it hasn't sat well with the founder, so that's why we haven't been competitive in those situations.
Okay. And Reed, you and I have talked about managing the transition out of the hands of the owner, founder, entrepreneur. Can you, and then I'll throw it out to others on the panel, but what do you do? What are the kinds of things that you do to keep them motivated post-transaction when you take a majority?
I think it's mostly just rollover equity and incentive equity, and then ideally an earnout or a combination of 2 or 3 of those.
Yeah, we're the same way. If we're investing in a business where the founders wants to stay on and involved, the rollovers probably the biggest piece of that. Frankly, on the incentive side, we would like to try to incentivize the next tier of management more with options and things like that, realizing those will more likely be the people that will be selling the company when we go to exit. Typically, the founder will probably move on, not always, but we will use earnouts occasionally. They can get messy. We, as a firm, we say we rarely use them, though. I think if you look at the numbers, we use them a lot more than we'd like to admit. But they can be messy, and incentives aren't always aligned, especially if you use it in the context of an add-on acquisition or where you're merging businesses together. Then it can be really difficult to manage. We've had a lot of success, frankly, in buying businesses and doing the kind of transitioning the owner out, not necessarily by our desire, but by their desire, early on in the process, and really incentivizing that next layer of management who may have only had some type of nominal sale bonus when we made our investment, but really aligning incentives through options, and have been amazed, frankly, at what that will do for people, and kind of how hard they'll work, and the results that we've driven through that process. It's not rocket science. It's not like we invented it, but we've had a number of really successful outcomes that have come when we bought a business from a founder who had, who might have been the CEO, but had a COO or a president who was really kind of running the day-to-day operations, and just by getting them the proper incentives and kind of giving them the room that they need without this other person over them, it had some good outcomes.
In the practice management deals we're in, say the platforms have very few earnouts. It's probably a function of there's tons of capital out there and people are paying full price up front. We've seen them on the more on the add-ons with the smaller, like 1 to 3 provider practices, and it's a small add-on. I think the only other thing I'd add is oftentimes in the practice management space we see these non-compete clauses. Maybe these are local businesses, like you're not going to drive 2 hours to go see a dermatologist, so they might have like a 30-mile radius of a non-compete, or oftentimes like buyout clauses for doctors to get bought out if they want to compete in that area. Those can be like 1 to 2 years. The non-compete clause.
I think it's been covered.
Okay. More general question, but I know that we talked a little bit about the regulatory environment and changing of that to value-based purchasing. What do you think makes healthcare deals more unique or difficult than other sectors? Is it the regulatory environment? Is it some of the reimbursement issues? What would you say makes them more difficult or unique? And then what do you do to mitigate those? Do you engage consultants to look at the billings to the extent there's government reimbursement? Do you rely on outside experts? What are some of the things you do when you're exploring those deals to mitigate some of that concern, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of, and they're kind of two sides of the same coin, which is regulations and the reimbursement. And usually what we do just to better understand that is, consult our legal counsel, obviously, but also get a third-party report like a Marwood report to better understand, the rate environment and any risks in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, we take this similar approach. And to some extent, we avoid investments that are have significant reimbursement. We realize we're going to pay for it in terms of the multiple going in typically, because there are a lot of firms that like to avoid those types of stroke at the pen risks, and drives the price up. And we've had in the past too many situations where we were on the wrong side of things. So it's there's a certain threshold that you hit from the reimbursement profile of a business where we're just not the right buyer for that asset. So that's a decision that we've made institutionally. It's very much a trade-off, but one that has worked out well more recently for us.
Yeah,
Sure.
actually, I think we are, if I heard this right, we're not shying away from reimbursement risk. We, I think, did some analysis during the last fundraise, and about a third of our portfolio has some form of reimbursement. exposure, direct reimbursement exposure. The way we mitigate about it is four ways. One is we want to be on the right side of healthcare, which means what everybody here I think understands is better outcomes, lower costs. So there's models on the substance abuse side and some other areas, freestanding ER clinics where there's a trade-off between short-term profitability versus long-term viability. So we try to avoid these situations. Two, we always make sure we have a strong compliance program in place in our companies. So during the time of diligence, we evaluate what the current practices are. If they need augmentation, maybe they have to hire a chief compliance officer if they don't already have one. Three, we do work with consultants like Marwood and others to do CPT code level analysis of the rates over time and geography. And there's a lot of analysis you can do, but at the same time you realize it's a rear view sort of analysis, and nobody has a crystal ball, but at least it gives you some degree of comfort. And then the last one is a bit about structuring. So obviously there's no better protection than buying right. So that's always a plus. And then structuring things maybe where there's a liquidation preference. We didn't talk about this until now, but some of our transactions have a one-time liquidation preference where we take our capital first before we participate pro rata. This is not a participant preferred, but it's just we get our capital first and then we start. So there's some downside protection, but we think, again, for the right situations, taking on that type of risk could be rewarded. In the areas where we have done it is autism. I think, as you mentioned, high valuation, but for a reason. And reimbursement there is not going to change, I think, anytime soon. Hospice as well. I think it had in the past some changes, but it's pretty stable. And then similar to home health, we feel there's been changes, but it's a bit more stable these days.
Right. And then for those deals that have died or not moved forward, can you talk about what the causes of that might have been? Did you find something during your reimbursement checks or your consultant scores? What are some of the reasons that deals don't actually move forward and get finished?
Beyond valuation.
Beyond valuation, yeah.
I think for us, like on the accounting side, I think like revenue cycle issues. So Q of E might discover there's a big discrepancy between revenue and cash collections. So there's obviously some issue from a billing and collection standpoint. I think that's usually the biggest one, and then obviously a compliance issue. I mean, like derm, for example, a couple of years ago there was a big issue with most procedure, and there was a huge rate cut on the pathology side, and that's one area whenever we look at derm businesses, we look at how much they're billing compared to the average dermatology practice. I think pediatric dental, there's been a lot of crackdowns from Medicaid in terms of just a lot of upcoding and overbilling. So I think there's certain practice management areas that have had abuse in the past, so you have to pay attention to those areas.
For us, it's been mostly around just getting comfortable with the transition plan. We go into a deal thinking somebody is not quite as key to the business as they actually are, and we have trouble getting comfortable in that regard. And the second thing would be just chart audits. When we look at the charts or we look at the QA compliance regimen, that isn't sufficient for our standards. So I think those are the big two buckets that have driven us to kill most deals.
Anyone else? Do you see any a lack of sophistication of service providers for some of the smaller providers where there's been accounting issues or legal compliance issues, structuring issues? Do you run into that a lot? Does that kill the deal, or can that kill the deal for you?
Can you clarify? I saw it when we discussed. I was with.
I will say that the deals that we've done, sometimes we'll see structuring, or we'll have, it's a small provider and they have used a local accountant or a small legal shop and have had some of these compliance issues. You mentioned of not having a compliance officer. If you don't see that sophistication given the healthcare environment and how restrictive and regulated it is that something that makes you walk away, or is that something you think you can fix?
Yeah,
a lot of
I view it more
times?
as an opportunity, actually.
Okay.
And again, there's a balance between,
Yeah.
at some point you're on the other side of the tipping point, but it depends what type of risk it is. Sometimes there's a bit more of a clear, bright line test, but sometimes, compliance can be improved, revenue cycle management functions. These companies, with many of us investing in, they are less professional, they're subscale, so they need our help to get them to that next level. That's the real opportunity.
Yeah.
But one thing I was going to say on why some deals have died is I think the seller not being ready. Actually, they might have thought they are, but at the end, sometimes the biggest enemy for us is the timing's not right for one reason or another. And then the other thing is during diligence, realizing perhaps there was a bit less substance to the business. It might be still a little bit subscale. We've had a few of those instances. Or it's a bit more of a services business as opposed to technology. We're looking at a couple of telemedicine opportunities, and you hope that it's more technology than people, but it turned out to be more people. So at the same time, somebody could come in and say, this is a great opportunity, right? Because we can do it. So it's to each their own a little bit.
I think to Vlad's point, in some cases, what the shortcomings of some of the businesses, especially in the lower middle market, give rise to some of the biggest opportunities in terms of improvements that can be made to help take those businesses to the next level, which then better positions the company for our exit to a potentially different buyer universe. We're able to gain additional scale and introduce it to another set of financial buyers that focus on larger deals, or becomes that much more appealing to strategic buyers once companies have a little bit more scale to them. So it really is a function of kind of how you view that risk reward profile, in terms of the deal process themselves and the advisors. I bet that we all have advisors we use and trust and go to on a regular basis. So when we're reviewing a sell side Q of E from some lesser known accountant shop in New Mexico or wherever the business is headquartered, we're going to take the Q of E that they're providing with a grain of salt and do our own work. We're not going to ever put too much faith into that. So I wouldn't say that we rely on those so they don't necessarily kill some disproportionate share of deals. It's just part of doing the work.
Can that make it harder to get the providers over the hump of why that may not be something that you want to rely on? If yours comes back kind of looking different, can that be a...
it can create an issue where they say, oh, well, we did a Q of E, and that's just something that have to work through. Yeah, so it can be like anything else where they feel they've checked that box for you when in reality they haven't. I mean, frankly, even if it's a big four accounting firm, we're going to do our own work, right? So I think that's present in any deal, regardless of the relative size or sophistication of the service provider.
Yeah, we run into some problems with legal counsel specifically where, it's a founder-owned company and they want to use the attorney that did their will, their divorce settlement, and I was doing their M&A transaction, and they really lack sophistication, but it comes out pretty quickly whether they're self-aware enough to know what they don't know and willing to be collaborative in the transaction, or it's just they're going to be really difficult to work with.
Which just means more legal bills.
Right. Throw it out there. Yeah.
Sasha Cahill, CEO of Integrated Care. Traditionally, when I entered, healthcare space several years ago, my focus was on AI and digital health. I've had several companies. However, Integrated Care is a different company. It's a service-based business in the genetics space. And to my surprise, I found that revenue, it's been a very lucrative space. So my question is specifically to Reed and to Vlad. It's a twofold question. As far as investments in the genetic space and stem cells, as I'm evaluating my current business and another business, what's your take? Any interest, any maybe successes or failures you can share? Thank you.
It's an area we're probably not spending as much time. I think there is need for those services in companies. I think we're in our third fund now, maybe just a little history. Earlier on when we started out, again, on the capital and healthcare, we had more of an opportunistic approach and did some things a bit earlier. I think some of the challenges with these businesses, where they are in the commercialization phase, and for us, certainly revenue has to be there, close to profitability, obviously preferably within profitability. But so what I can say is that often we try to look within our own ecosystem of LPs to make a referral. It's not a question really, but it's just not an area we're spending much time. Unless it's something where there's an existing business and this is maybe a new area where it's trying to grow. So you're buying already some EBITDA, but this is sort of a growth engine for some new area. Not sure if it's helpful.
So we looked at some companies in that space. Admittedly, I was not on that deal team that looked at this one that I'm referring to specifically. But most of those we've looked at were not cash flow positive, so they were burning cash, which probably means we're not the best partner for those companies.
What if it's profitable?
Yeah, that's a different situation.
I mean, we have aside from the traditional private equity sort of banking, investment banking background, we have an individual on our team who is a physician as well. So that opens not only his own expertise, but also a whole another sort of list of relationships he can bring to the table to evaluate an opportunity like that. I think sometimes you asked Taryn earlier the question, healthcare being technical or not. I think a lot of us spend time in healthcare that's where some generalists play as well is more hardcore. We don't do the PhD type of investing, but for some of those resources, I think if I understand the way you're spending time in your business, it would be something we could look at.
Anyone else have any questions for the panel?
How do you handle a situation if you take the majority ownership and some time through you have a misalignment and the original founder wants to exit prior to their employment contracts and you need them to stay on?
Purely a hypothetical.
In terms of exit, you mean just leave his position or wants to cash out his ownership stake or yes to everything?
Yes to all.
Yeah, we've had situations where we've had founders that were still involved that for a variety of different reasons have needed to transition out of businesses. In each situation, frankly, is unique. Some of it depends upon where we are in the investment cycle, where we are as in the investment, in the relative success of that investment as to, hey, is this, do we want to try to cash them out? It gets tricky if you're trying to cash someone out because a lot of times then all the other shareholders have rights where they can come along with them if they want. And so typically we would, if a transition is necessary, we can't make someone stay, right? These are typically, for us, it's service businesses with elevator assets, right? That come and go every day. And if you make them mad, they could decide not to come back, regardless. And so it's not a factory that we can just keep running. So it's just, we have to work with them and figure out a situation that's amenable for everyone. That's on the employment side. We'll recruit someone else in, do those types of things. On the investment side, it's a little different. We typically won't, just as a matter of rule, cash people out, especially at that type of a level, before we were to exit. There might be situations where lower level managers leave or get terminated where they have a much smaller amount of, whether it's ownership through options or direct shares. We'll enter into a conversation and typically in our equity documents we have a call right on equity if they leave at whatever fair market value is. But for the larger holders, we typically won't do that. Just creates a whole host of issues. But we'll work through the employment side of things. I don't know if others handle it differently or.
I agree with everything.
Anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
How are you in this environment? How might your deal sourcing strategies be different today than perhaps they've been in the past, if at all?
Yeah, no, it definitely is different for us. It's been probably in a nuanced way. We're not staffed such that we can have a dozen junior level folks on the phone every day drumming up a list of proprietary opportunities. That said, we are much more focused on trying to find situations where we have something unique to bring to a process, or we know an opportunity. We know a company before it gets into a process, which has caused us to rely much more on our executive network. We don't have a formal operating partner model, but just having invested in the sector for some time, we've got 6 former CEOs that are direct investors in our fund. So we try to leverage those individuals and, more importantly, their network and knowledge base to put us in positions in situations where it may be it's a deal that has an investment banker, but there is an immediate CEO transition that's needed. So something that's different from your plain vanilla down the middle of the fairway. Every generalist shop can do it. CEO transitions, it's not the most complex thing. You can find recruiters, but these are people that when we leverage our network, we feel like these are people that are somehow being vouched for by people that we know and trust and have worked with in the past, which just provides us with more comfort. Again, that network can also be helpful in sourcing deals. It wasn't on the healthcare side, but one of our most recent deals was a proprietary deal. It wasn't through a process that was sourced through an executive who had a friend. So that was looking to sell his business and for whatever reason, didn't hire a banker. So it has caused us to spend a lot more time leveraging that network, working with those executives to figure out where they're spending their time, which then more than ever drives where we're spending our time, where historically it was much more, hey, we got this book in, who do we know? It's almost kind of the other way around. We're a little more, or much more sector and theme focused, just trying to find areas where we realize we're not probably going to be the only buyer that's looking at the company, but at least we've got that knowledge base and some resources that could help us add value.
Well, I sort of highlight a little bit my role, but we did not used to have a dedicated business development professional. I used to initially be part of the investment team, and I think the transition actually is a powerful one because you can take a lot of those skills, but that's something we did in the last year or so. So you've seen it more in the lower middle market funds starting to have a dedicated business development team in-house. Scott highlighted already a couple of areas, so I'll skip those, but I'll just highlight 2, which is you see more and more, I think, executive search firms that obviously they go out and recruit, but they also can at the same time be mandated as almost like a finder on a deal. Now the bar is much higher, but we've given it a try once, and so if they come across a situation where an exec is maybe transitioning between situations and they have already an asset in mind, they don't have the capital, but they have an asset in mind. So that's one way to be a bit more creative on the sourcing front to the question. Events I'd highlight, and not because we're here today with Opus, but I've never been prior to that to Opus, and now we do more of these. Axia was another one that we attend those events and having meetings with intermediaries. And the last one is more structural or philosophical one of just being more comfortable with roll-ups. I think historically we weren't. Just the risk is different. It's a bit of a startup risk. And I think just to be competitive and to have more control over how you shape the business versus paying 12 times for a dirt platform or more, we've got more comfortable with those earlier opportunities. But you've got to have the right team in place, right?
For us, on the pharma side, we have an advisor model. So we have several MD, PhD advisors that pretty much know what's going on in the pharma sector. So they bring us a lot of deals. On the services side, it seems like there's emerged almost a network of these one-man shop advisors that are basically going out and finding deals. And when they go out and market a deal, it tends to be a little bit more inefficient because they really don't know the right people to speak to. So we also try to just be as networked as possible in those types of organizations.
What are some of the differences that you see in investing in the healthcare industry versus the other industries you've been investing in? Because healthcare tends to have, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, the stigma of not adopting best practices. So what have you experienced in dealing with managing those in that sector versus the other industries? It's not bad.
Is that good?
I mean, that's the stigma. Yeah. Best practices, Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, et cetera, so in the managed healthcare area. I'm just wondering whether you see a difference in the management in those industries versus healthcare.
Well, I think from our standpoint, like that's usually the number one thing that we focus on is we talked a lot about regulatory compliance, and that's a big part of the third-party diligence at closing, but like we've never invested in a healthcare practice that had some even modestly gray area around the compliance side. So like I could think of practices where they have like internal 20-point checklists related to compliance, and maybe they have a bonus program every month to that location tied to compliance. There's only so much you could do. Even the compliance studies we're doing at closing might take 5 or 10% of your total charts. So, you know, the other 90% you're hoping is similar to the 5 to 10% you're looking at, and but there's definitely more regulatory risk from that standpoint than other industries. But at the same token, you know, we're talking about tariffs and all this stuff. You don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff, so that's good.
From a macro perspective, I definitely agree with the kind of thinking behind your question in terms of healthcare, not-for-profit, the stigma that it's not efficient. And you know, did have seen that. I think our experience, and partially because we avoid some of the managed care companies in some of the areas where you might find that, is that this differentiation between not-for-profit and for-profit doesn't always mean the not-for-profit's this altruistic firm that is focused purely on doing good and not driving efficiencies. Well, the most successful investment out of our current fund was in a non-transplant human tissue bank. So they provided cadaveric tissue for use by medical device and medical research organizations. And half that industry essentially is not-for-profit and half is for-profit. And as we got in there and we acquired a not-for-profit, our business was for-profit, found that they were much more efficiently operated in some ways than our business was. And the not-for-profit aspect was for a variety of historical issues and actually some kind of donor sourcing marketing reasons. So my direct experience says that, you know, in some ways it's not always the case, and it can be a bit of a misnomer, but I know that in some ways limited as a function of the areas in healthcare which we choose to focus on, whereas I think some of the areas that you're talking about, I can definitely, I mean, I conceptually agree with kind of the foundation of the question. It's just not, doesn't fall in our investment set.
Keep us on track. I'm going to stop us there. Rena, I don't know if Rena Bajwal is going to come up. She's in our DSP, Data Security and Privacy Group. We need to speak for a few minutes about that. And then before we get into our next panel.